Welcome to the Theology in Motion podcast. Join us for conversations about the theology of worship, its practice, culture, and design. The Theology in Motion podcast is by the Center for Worship Leadership, Christ College, Concordia University, Irvine, in California.
Welcome to Theology in Motion. My name is Steve Zank, and on behalf of the Center for Worship Leadership, we're glad that you are here. Today's guest is Dr. Lester Ruth, Research Professor of Christian Worship at Duke Divinity School. His particular interests are in the early church and in the past 250 years of the church, especially the history of contemporary praise and worship. He's passionate about enriching the worship life of congregations, regardless of style. He believes that careful reflection on worship, and especially that of worship of other Christians, whether past, present, Protestant, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, those reflections can serve to enrich the church today. Lately, he's been bringing that approach to inspire contemporary songwriters. Having grown concerned about the lack of a Trinitarian dimension, there's some great articles you can find on ATLA or EBSCO if you have access to a library to read that he's written on that topic. Dr. Ruth is a member of the Charles Wesley Society and served as president until the spring of 2016. Recently co-authored Lovin' on Jesus, A Concise History of Contemporary Worship with Dr. Sui Hong Lim. Together, they're also working on a new book, A History of Contemporary Praise and Worship, Understanding the Ideas That Reshaped the Protestant Church, a larger book. Looking forward to that coming out. That's still coming out this year. Is that right, Dr. Ruth?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Awesome. We're so glad you're here. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my great pleasure to be with you.
So we're talking about the history of contemporary worship today. And in that conversation, there are several terms that need to be defined. Amongst the most important are the idea of a traditional worship service and a contemporary worship service. When you use those terms, what do you mean by them?
Sure. I think in terms of traditional worship, I might find two types of that, actually. I know oftentimes people lump it all together and form kind of a strict dichotomy between traditional and contemporary, but I think a better approach is to actually nuance it a little bit. So in terms of traditional, I think you have the older forms of Protestant worship of the early 20th and mid-20th century, kind of a period of Protestant ascendancy here in the United States. And the pinnacle of which is probably kind of how extensive archaic English is in. The sermon is also king in the service. Things tended to be fairly formal. People dressed up for worship. The manner in which it was conducted was fairly staid and formal, at least in white churches. But there's another form of traditional worship that starts emerging very late 60s, but especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And this stylistically looks a lot like the previous form of traditional worship in terms of ceremony and robes and choirs and song repertoire, that sort of thing. But what's different here is that this is a movement, it's called the Liturgical Movement, that's strongly influenced by worship in the early church. And so there's a resurgence for lectionary use, ecumenical 3-year lectionary, re-emphasis on the centrality of baptism and the Lord's Supper, re-emphasis on a full church year. And so, a lot of people would still call that traditional worship too, but it's actually different than the previous form of traditional worship.
Right.
Now, juxtaposed against both of those is, what most folks would call contemporary worship. Different song repertoire. Choruses and short pieces, much more highly repetitive than the typical hymn is. Change in musical instrumentation, concern for relevance and accessibility of the service. So there's appropriation of kind of lots of cultural forms of doing large-scale rituals. And informality. People started dressing down, and all of those get lumped up under contemporary worship. If I can note the irony here is, even though traditional in both of its forms and contemporary often get opposed to each other, that newer form of traditional worship and contemporary worship actually had the same goal, which was to displace that older form of traditional Protestant worship.
Interesting. Yeah,
it's a deep irony that is often overlooked, just because stylistically, if you look at the veneer of them, they look so different.
Yeah.
But neither the newer traditional worship, that almost sounds like an oxymoron, but I think your listeners will know what I'm talking about, and contemporary worship, they both were displeased with that older early 20th and mid 20th century form of Protestant worship.
As you led us through that description, it makes me wonder which came first, the title traditional or the title contemporary, because we think about traditional as the older style in a certain way, but in a way it feels like the moniker traditional may have been a reaction to the moniker contemporary or something.
I think there's a lot of evidence for that, actually. There are two waves of use of the term contemporary worship in the 20th century. And the first one actually arises in the late 1960s, when a lot of mainline Christians and some evangelicals, concerned about how rapidly culture was changing and fearful that the church's worship was getting out of sync with where people were culturally, they started doing experimentation, and they used the term contemporary worship for that. And I think that's probably also the first surge of the term traditional worship too, because you want to kind of have a dichotomous or a binary that you're working off of. The second wave of the use of the term contemporary worship actually arose very late 1980s, early 1990s. Again, concerned that people and culture were out of sync with each other. But this time, mainline folks and some evangelicals were starting to look to some mega churches, and some literature. In fact, some denominational offices were really advocating that proposed form of contemporary worship there in the 1980s. That was the heyday, actually. Yeah. And that's that time, that early to mid 1990s, is what we're still living in the shadow of right now.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the book you wrote with Su-Hong Lim was the way in which you identified contemporary worship's sources, not just as a single source, but the many different influences that go into the movement. And maybe it's better to say the multiple movements that are kind of thought of as the same by a lot of people, but there are a lot of different movements that are accompanying this rise of contemporary worship. And I thought maybe we can kind of get into this topically. So I have a few statements here, and if you're up for it, I'll read the statement. It's maybe a stereotype, and then you can help us sort through that stereotype. Do you think it's mostly true? Where are the ways in which the stereotype is true? And insofar as it is, maybe if you could help us understand why it came to be that way, as far as you're able. So the first one of these statements is, I've heard people a lot say it this way. They say traditional worship is formal, while contemporary worship is informal. Does that stereotype hold true? And if so, where does that come from?
It does not hold absolutely true. If we try to quit squeezing everything into one box or to one tightly kind of formed container, that this is what contemporary worship looks like, there have actually been multiple sort of expressions of it, or a variety of expressions of it. Before I answer your question, if I can just back up and broaden the term that we're using, that will
Good.
help explain the diversity.
Good.
So when I'm writing about this academically and I'm teaching, I usually don't use the term contemporary worship if I'm trying to find a term to embrace the entire phenomenon. I think a better term is a new term that Dr. Lim and I tend to use called contemporary praise and worship. And that's because some of the roots for this are Pentecostal, and the preferred term among Pentecostals is praise and worship. And indeed, some of the people doing praise and worship actually don't even say praise and worship. They just say worship.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to use an all-encompassing term in order to get to just to blast the side out of the boxes and lay this all out on a really wide table.
Are we calling it then contemporary praise and worship?
Yeah, that's the term that I use.
Let's try it.
And it also has the benefit. I haven't forgotten your question yet, Steve.
That's right.
I will answer it, but so I can describe this term a little bit more. I also find this this broader term also useful to describe the phenomenon globally and also across races.
Mm-hmm.
So here in the United States, it really tends to be only white mainline churches and white evangelical churches that will speak of contemporary worship. By the time you take in Pentecostalism and you take in African American and Hispanic forms of this new way of worship, the preferred term there is praise and worship. And once you go globally, the preferred term is praise and worship globally also.
Is that definition then drawing our attention to contemporary praise and worship, to the idea that in this movement, praise, our worship of God, is a very important, if not a fundamental aspect of this movement? Is that a fair way to approach it?
It is foundational for many of the tributaries of it, yes.
Mm-hmm.
For both the headwaters, for the Pentecostal side of this story, and the tributaries that feed into it. That is the common link. It's almost a sacramental sort of efficacy or association. The key verse is Psalm 22:3, that God is the Holy One who inhabits or is enthroned upon the praises of Israel. And once you start looking for that verse, sometimes cited, oftentimes not even cited, but just quoted or paraphrased, once you get the association between praise and God's presence, that explains the entire praise and worship half of this equation and becomes the foundational thought that motivates the whole thing. And it prioritizes praise then. That's why we have praise teams, we have praise choruses, we have praise and worship. Even the term itself points to that. So the idea as it gets worked out in practice is that as the community, as the church praises God and God becomes present to the congregation and they become aware of being in God's presence, that's when they start shifting over to worship.
That would be in line with a lot of, especially Pentecostal theology and the way that they consider sacraments. So it's, in a way, this praise and worship movement has given language to Pentecostal churches to consider themselves more sacramental. I've read some articles in that way talking about that. For churches that maybe have a different kind of worship theology, and maybe disagree with that part of contemporary worship, it's worth noting that that is, in some ways, foundational approach for many who are engaged in praise and worship, contemporary worship.
Yes. Most of the songs that have had permanence come from those Pentecostal roots. Most of the companies that produced, recorded, and distributed the songs come from those Pentecostal roots. all of the early conferences to teach how to do it came from those Pentecostal roots.
Yeah.
Much of the key infrastructure, so like CCLI, Christian Copyright Licensing International, come from those Pentecostal roots. And so much of it was developed, the songs, the companies, the infrastructure, the conferences, even the degree programs come from those Pentecostal roots. The global spread of it comes from the Pentecostal roots, because you started having people with this theology of praise and worship begin to take missionary trips around the world, starting in the late 1940s into the 1950s. I mean, my favorite little factoid there is that the Inuit people in the Canadian Arctic were already doing praise and worship by the mid 1950s.
Wow.
You would never have guessed, but by mid to late 1950s, it's in Europe, it's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's in Central and South America.
Does this represent, so this is a little bit off my notes, but this is an interesting part of the conversation. In the history of the movement, in the history of the church, does this represent a little bit of a theological shift for some people? Whereas in the older, the form of worship for which they were coming didn't have this feature maybe as much, where they would praise God, then experience his presence, then respond to his presence. Maybe they were used to different hymnal style approaches where they maybe confess their sins first or something, or write other things.
Yeah.
Does this represent a change for some churches in their theology through this movement?
Oh, I think it definitely does. For outside of the United States, so folks in Central South America, Africa, and Asia, even if they belong to mainline denominations or kind of classic evangelical denominations like Baptist, there's been a Pentecostalizing of those churches.
Yeah.
In many respects. It really is one of the outstanding or astonishing developments of the 20th century, even for Pentecostals, in that it's perhaps the first widespread systematizing of a Pentecostal approach to worship, one that's got deep buy-in and a clear form to it and an infrastructure to promote it and teach it. It's not like the piety is totally foreign to what went before, but it's much more organized in this praise and worship movement. And, even here in the United States, where mainline congregations may not pick up on that theology, they're still singing those same songs.
Yeah. So maybe it's helpful. There's a few things going on here that I see. One is almost like the contemporary movement is mirroring the liturgical movement. That those, as you were saying, there's two traditional movements. One's the 1950s-ish way of doing things. Next to it is the liturgical movement, hearkening back to the first 3 centuries of worship. Then there's this contemporary movement pushing for some renewal. It seems like both the contemporary movement and the liturgical movement are kind of calling for more participation of the congregation. And contemporary worship kind of gives that to the people through the way it approaches singing and engagement of worship, especially in kind of blocks of time, as opposed to a hymn-fitting pre-sermon hymn, those kinds of things. But giving space in the service for participation of length of the congregation seems to be one of the Pentecostal tradition's contributions, whether or not you disagree with the approach of the sacramentalness of singing per se or worship per se. But it seems like what I'm hearing you say is that no matter what tradition you're in, it's important to understand and engage with that much of the contemporary movement is paired with Pentecostal theology. And so it's important to be aware of that. And insofar as your tradition finds it certain portions helpful to run with it, insofar as there's disagreements, just to be aware of those differences, not to say we're right, you're wrong in the global church. That's what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is for the local practitioner, if there are ways in which your theology does not reflect Pentecostal theology, just to be aware that there's some of that embedded in certain songs and hymns of that tradition.
Yeah. That Pentecostal theology kind of seeps into mainline and evangelical congregations doing contemporary worship, one through the songs, oftentimes. I'm trying to think of an older chorus. I will enter his gates with thanksgiving in my heart. I will enter his courts with praise. That's a song that we sang in the 70s. That is a straight Pentecostal song building on that praise and worship theology, filtered through Psalm 104. Now, I was singing that song in my early 20s, but I had no idea what the roots were.
Interesting.
Or in the 1980s, if you were singing Laurie Klein's I Love You, Lord, and I Lift My Voice.
Yeah.
That is a song, that is the go-to song once God has made his presence manifest among you and you slip over into worship. But I know there are lots of congregations doing that. Or even, I'm trying to think through my own United Methodist hymnal. We have Jack Hayford's song Majesty in there.
Yep.
Majesty, worship his majesty. Hayford actually has a little bit different translation of Psalm 22:3. He knows Hebrew. He did his own translation. And so he interprets Psalm 22:3 that God is enthroned upon the praises of Israel. Very strong royal monarch sort of notions. And so it's no surprise that Hayford's renowned song actually is Psalm 22:3b in song form as we praise God in very royal terms. And so that all slips over. The influence also slips over through some of these mega churches. And big scale preachers who take the Pentecostal material and reframe it and domesticate it.
Yeah.
So I know you're in Southern California. If any of your other listeners are in Southern California and have ever gone or been influenced by Saddleback, for instance, what happened there is that their former worship leader, Rick Muchchow, learned praise and worship while he was touring as part of a Christian music group, evangelical Christian music group, and they sang in a Pentecostal church once, and he learned that praise and worship theology. When he got hired at Saddleback, he and Rick Warren sat down and reframed that. So if you've ever learned their impact, which is how they sequence songs, and I've forgotten exactly what the acronym stands for, but
that's all right.
If you've ever learned that paradigm from Saddleback, that's their domestication of that older praise and worship theology.
Yeah.
Similarly, Willow Creek would bring in Pentecostal worship leaders to teach their musicians and their worship leaders there at Willow Creek how to fully enter into praise and worship. Indeed, there's an interesting story that's sin loving on Jesus, and we found out a little bit more about it. Bill Hybels, former pastor there at Willow Creek, taking his summer sabbatical in Western Michigan at his lake house, spent the summer in a Black holiness church that was fully involved in praise and worship. And he became enamored after his experience in that African-American church one summer of what it meant to be able to go through praise and to enter into deep worship.
Thanks for that. Thanks for explaining that history. I would love to have a robust conversation about Psalm 22:3 sometime. I think that there's a lot of perspectives on that verse, and I think it's fertile ground for conversation sometime with a group of people who are thinking deeply about that.
Oh, I think so too. I want your listeners to realize that I'm approaching this as a historian. So I don't necessarily agree with the theology, but I'm going to report it and understand it on a fair basis.
Good.
In fact, I think what that whole praise and worship tradition undervalues is the strong prophetic Christological nature of that psalm, and how praise is combined with lament in some really interesting ways, and how that psalm itself, in fact, I was just rereading it this morning, is really like a blow-by-blow description of what that first Good Friday, the day of crucifixion, was like. And so there's some nuances of meaning, or not even nuances, there're just some overt meanings in that psalm that the praise and worship folks oftentimes don't pick up on. Steve, let me go back to your earlier question about formality, informality. Is that always true? Formality always true about traditional worship, and informality always true about contemporary worship? Perhaps if those are the terms we're using, but if we're talking about contemporary praise and worship as a more encompassing sort of category, much of the early praise and worship, that line of the larger phenomenon, would have been fairly formal. In fact, some of these folks would have been the last hanger-ons for the use of the King James Version of the Bible. They would have kept in their coats and ties for men all the way into the 1990s, and dresses for women all the way through the 80s and the 90s. That dichotomy really just plays out internally within mainline tensions over this.
Awesome. Let's get into another one of the stereotypes. Traditional worship is for the insider, and contemporary worship is for the outsider. How's that stereotype sound to you?
No, again, I would want to nuance that. And like many statements, there's a seed of truth in it, but not enough for me to say, yes, that's absolute.
That's right.
So again, looking at this broader phenomenon of contemporary praise and worship, one of the tributaries feeding into that is an evangelistically oriented tributary that is concerned about the outsider. So there's an element of truth in it, but not entirely looking at contemporary praise and worship. It's also not true in terms of looking at traditional worship, if you're considering that newer form of traditional worship that's influenced by the early church. There was real emphasis in the 70s and 80s and 90s among mainline congregations trying to reappropriate that older patristic material to reestablish hospitality and hospitable preparation for entrance into the church, particularly through baptism. In fact, that's what I thought my original dissertation topic in the 1990s was going to be on, was appropriating the forms of preparation for baptisms in an evangelistic way for mainline traditional churches of the 1990s. And ended up not doing that. But again, it's a completely sort of false dichotomy in a pure, absolute sort of way.
That's so interesting. We just interviewed Dr. Kent Burris and Rhoda Schuler about their work on the catechumenate leading up to baptism. I bet you would have a great conversation with them about that topic. All right, so we debunked that one. But what are some of the ways in which that desire to be more evangelistic through worship in a new, renewed sense, what are some of the ways that you can see that in the movement itself?
I think the first way I can see it in the movement itself, and this is one of the dead giveaways when I'm seeing that line of thought, is that there's usually a key scripture verse that they quote, that the folks in this mind, and it's 1 Corinthians 9:22, that I'll become all things to all people so that I might win some. And it actually becomes a biblical rationale for what I would call a hyper-enculturation of worship. And that's where a real distinction comes from traditional forms, either the older or the newer form of traditional worship, is the level of how blank the slate is considered to be in order to create a form of worship that is hospitable and accessible and attractive to people. And so within contemporary praise and worship, those who have put all their eggs in the evangelizing basket, they normally cite that 1 Corinthians 9:22 passage. They often cite the incarnation of Jesus as the key example of the extent to which God is willing to go. In fact, I like Philippians 2, the self-emptying of God in order to make grace available to people. You tie that in with a suspicion of inherited forms wherever they come from, and you get what I call this hyper-enculturation and the willingness to do more radical adaptations. The other thing that often gets connected to that, and you can see it in those who are teaching that perspective, is the use of business marketing metaphors and perspectives. I was looking at this really interesting passage from my own dissertation director, believe it or not, James White, who had a period in the late 60s, early 70s where he was one of the most prolific authors in experimenting to do contemporary worship. And, his point of reference was the whooping that General Motors was putting on Ford for a period of time, because Ford was locked into producing only one kind of worship and one color and in one kind of car in one color and one style. And General Motors is coming along and creating a whole range of models, different colors and that sort of thing. And so what White was advocating was that no one single way of worship is adequate in a culturally diverse environment. And our worship needs to be stylistically different. And not surprisingly, he references 1 Corinthians 9:22 at that point, willingness to become all things to all people so that we might win some.
That's a profound point. And I know that his work, James White's work, was also a bit of a frame for your own work, Loving on Jesus, right? You took on some of his frameworks to talk about this movement.
Yeah, I mean, I knew him well. He was my dissertation director. And so Loving on Jesus was framed using the same liturgical topics that he did his well-known Introduction to Christian Worship book. And beyond the topics, we're also trying to reflect his mind frame. He was also a professor for the co-author, Sui Hong Lim. And the great thing about Jim White as a historian is he wanted to understand everyone on their own terms first. Before he brought a critique, he wanted to understand a way of worship from the inside out. And so if there's any generosity of spirit in Loving on Jesus, what we're doing is something that we actually learned from him. It's like, let's understand this on its own terms. Not that we're going to necessarily agree with it, but we think if there's a rebuttal to be made, the better rebuttal will be able to actually be done in conversation from deep familiarity, not just based on some caricature of it that you're setting up as a straw man to argue with.
Yeah, that's an encouragement. Thanks. And that comes across, I think, in your writing quite well. In these conversations with people we disagree with, how can we even begin to talk to them until we actually understand their position? And I think that's a really key insight.
Yeah. The hardest question any student ever asks me is this one. Dr. Ruth, who got worship right in the history of the church? And I don't have a good answer, because if you approach it generously, every way of worship has its own internal logic.
Mm-hmm.
And every way of worship has some element of strength and reasonableness to it. Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. I mean, no one shows up on Sunday morning thinking, let's see how badly we can do it today.
Right.
I mean, no one ever shows up on Sunday morning thinking that. But I also think every way of worship this side of the coming of Jesus has some potential weaknesses or pitfalls to it.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes closely tied to what the strengths of the way of worship are. So, yeah, just my reflections generally on my historical philosophy for approaching 2,000 years. I tell you what, with that philosophy, it opens up everyone who's ever worshiped as a Christian as a interesting potential subject matter. I think it also fits being a Methodist liturgical historian too.
Yeah.
Because we're such a hybrid tradition.
Mm.
We literally, from the Methodist liturgical front porch, you can see everybody. You can see pietists.
Yeah.
You can see Puritans. You can see evangelicals. My ancestors in Methodism 200 years ago, they fellowshipped with Quakers.
Yeah.
And then through its Anglican roots, you have the whole wealth of the classic Western liturgical tradition. And because of the Eastern patristic influence on the two Wesley brothers, you have elements of Eastern theologizing in the way that we approach salvation. From the Methodist front porch, you can see everybody.
That's a great analogy. Let's go to another topic here. Here's another stereotype. Traditional worship is generally the songs are about God, and in contemporary praise and worship, the songs are generally to God.
Oh, Steve, that's a stereotype that I hear lots and lots and lots, even by the people within the phenomenon. But if you actually sit down and do quantified analysis, it just does not play out whatsoever. The older hymnody that the folks are talking about as only talking about God, and I've actually done this study and published on it. When you take a look at the content of it, lots of that older hymnody is actually prayer addressed to God. So it is speaking to God. Similarly, if you take a look at the contemporary worship songs, and increasingly so over the last 20 years, more and more of those are about God, talking, still honoring God, but doing so indirectly. My own theory that I haven't been able to prove yet is actually a linguistic one. And I'm influenced by a linguistic professor, John McWhirter, who wrote this really interesting book about 15, 20 years ago called Doing Our Own Thing. And what he says is that in the 1960s, a major shift took place in Americans and how they understood public speech. So we went from thinking that well-crafted speech, thoughtfully done, well-structured, was true and authentic, to thinking that more colloquial forms of speaking were true and authentic.
Interesting.
Just compare presidential speeches. In fact, compare the sort of popular songs of the early 20th century and pop songs since the 1960s. Bye Bye American Pie, drove my Chevy to the levee and the levee was dry. What in the world is that talking about? Okay. But we just have different ears now. And so I think what's happened is that the older, well-structured, metrical, clear rhyming scheme language of the hymns strikes the modern American ear as not as authentic, or even perhaps inauthentic, and therefore at best it's just about God. Whereas the contemporary worship songs, which are written in a wide variety of colloquial idioms, they sound truer. And since prayer is at the core of all forms of Christian worship, if what we're saying is actually truer to what we think this is about, then we're talking to God in these contemporary worship songs.
So it sounds like the argument is, it's not that the songs themselves have substantially changed, it's that our cultural ears have changed and we hear them differently.
Our cultural perceptions have changed. I think there's a second development in terms of cultural perception too. And I've tried to find the literature to see if my theory would hold true, but I'm going to lay out my theory.
Yeah, good.
Listeners can take what it is. I think how English-speaking people address each other has shifted over the last couple of hundred years, so that we used to have ways of address that in expression looked indirect, but in intention were actually direct. So for instance, imagine my wife and I were out for a romantic dinner on Valentine's Day, and the waiter came over and he said, I just want to wish you a happy Valentine's Day here. And now my wife is directly across the table from me. I look at the waiter and I go, I just want you to know, and I want the whole restaurant to know that I have the most beautiful wife on the face of the earth. And in terms of sharpest intellect, she runs circles around everyone else. And I just start laying on all these platitudes that everybody around us at all the other tables are listening to. But the real intent is for all those platitudes to end up in her ears.
Yeah.
I'm praising her, but I'm doing so in an indirect sort of fashion. This possibility came to mind because as I was trying to research this, actually in the linguistics library here at Duke, I was talking to the linguistics librarian who was from South Africa. She says, what you're saying makes perfectly good sense to me, because when I was a small girl growing up in South Africa, and if I wanted to address my mother and ask her if she wanted something, I would never say, do you want a glass of water? I would always say, does mother want a glass of water? The respect is built into the indirect nature of the language. So I have this theory that 200 years ago, even the indirect speech about God, if it's praising and honoring God, was actually intended for consumption by the ears of God.
Right. It's direct address crafted and indirectly, because that was culturally the approach.
And the indirection itself is one of the ways that you honor God.
Right. Yeah. And this is the value of understanding our history. These kind of topics
let me repeat, that is my theory, which I've not been able to prove.
That's right.
You would think that there would be some linguist who would have decided to analyze this, some social linguist, is a line of linguistic studies, who would have decided, I'm going to analyze speech patterns in the church's worship. But amazingly, they analyze a lot of other things, but not the actual content of Christian worship.
If you're a linguist listening to the show today, send us an email. We want you to talk to you about this. This is good ground for conversation.
Please, because I keep repeating this, and if I'm wrong, I need to be corrected.
Good. All right, let's take another one of these statements here, the stereotype. I've heard it said that traditional worship is very Trinitarian in its approach, while contemporary praise and worship tends to be less so, whether focused on Jesus as a single part of the Trinity or something else, rather than being Trinitarian as a whole?
That is true depending on what kind of traditional worship you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about text-based traditions, so Lutheran, Anglican, Episcopal, even some Reformed types, Presbyterians and Methodist, if a denominational body has produced the liturgy, it will tend to be Trinitarian. Exceptions to that would be the descendants, particularly up north and in New England, of Unitarians
Sure.
from the 18th and 19th century.
Sure.
I mean, there's a beautiful chapel in Boston, King's Chapel, I'm wanting to say. It's in downtown Boston. It's a classic 18th century building, and essentially it is a detrinitized Episcopal Book of Common Prayer that they've been using for a couple of 100 years. So that traditional worship is very Unitarian and non-traditional. But generally, Lutheran, Anglican, Episcopal, United Methodist, Presbyterian, if the denomination produces a worship resource, it will tend to be Trinitarian. But traditional Baptist worship, not necessarily so. Traditional forms of worship that arise out of pietism or evangelicalism, so there's a strong affective base for the worship. They expression of love is critical. Those traditions often will have a hard time not having a hyper Jesus focus.
Interesting.
Even their traditional forms, because and it's where we got the title for the book, actually. This sounds strange to say. Jesus has the unfair advantage over God the Father and the Holy Spirit, and that he's the one who had a human body. And so if your entire liturgical spirituality is driven by the affection of love, expressed in certain ways, it's easier to have that affection attached to a body that you can visualize in a manger, reaching out and touching somebody and healing them, wearing clothes that you could grab the hem of the garment of, or more visually being nailed to the cross. If you have that sort of liturgical piety, you're going to be deeply attached to Jesus, even in your traditional form of worship. Because almost all of contemporary praise and worship comes out of some tributary with pietistic roots, that does tend to carry over to contemporary praise and worship in all of its forms. Pentecostal, evangelical, or even mainline. Oftentimes the first mainliners attracted to contemporary praise and worship were folks who have evangelical pieties. And so that's one of the reasons they like the songs, because they love on Jesus quite a bit.
I didn't know that was the connection with the title of the book. I'm glad to know it. I appreciate that. And to express kind of the colloquial strand in some strains or tributaries, contemporary praise and worship, we put the first word loving in a colloquial form, dropped off the G and put an apostrophe there. Yeah. It's great. It's in a way, it really testifies to the historian approach that you were talking about, the way you approach the writing of this book. Can you help us understand, as a church struggle with these movements, how come they weren't incorporated into the worship of the church? Why do they result in a split of style? Does that make sense?
Or if I can try to summarize, why are there so many mainline and evangelical congregations that have a 8:30 contemporary service and a 10 o'clock traditional service,
good.
And that's what you see on their marquee?
Yep, good.
I think there are a variety of reasons why these new impulses, both this newer form of traditional worship based in the early church and contemporary praise and worship, why they never seem to form their own new thing in combination. Part of it is what was influencing mainline and evangelical congregations from the 1970s forward, which was the church growth movement, which is a missiological theory, primarily being taught out of Fuller Seminary in Southern California. It's a missiological theory that emphasizes strong enculturation, strong cultural reading. And so what was apparent to everyone is that we had a culturally fractured America from the 1960s onward. And so what the church growth advocates always said was figure out who your target audience is and shape a way of worship to fit them.
Right.
Not surprisingly, all these church growth advocates also were citing 1 Corinthians 9:22. Okay. So that's amazing. So that's what's being taught. And they're teaching that to pastors and denominational officials. Some of them have seminary positions. And so as new pastors are coming through seminary, that's what they're being taught. And if your congregation has 2 or 3 sort of target audiences that they're aiming for, you need multiple services differentiated by style. This all gets caught up in the 1980s with growing sense of distinct generations. So the baby boomers are a certain kind of people, baby busters are a certain kind of people, and I've got a whole shelves of popular books analyzing different generations and how to target different services. So that's one answer. The other answer is there's a lot of personal conflict and disdain among all the different proponents.
Yeah.
So like those who are advocating we need to look to the early church, they're earning degrees in that, they're creating structures, schools, institutions to teach that. When you have these folks come along who are saying, with a strong kind of iconoclastic bent, no, there's nothing in the past that we can trust. There's just a lot of personal antagonism and a lot of misspoken words and no attempt to try to see if there's any common ground. The stylistic veneer fools a lot of people because contemporary praise and worship usually presumes an extended period of congregational singing at the very beginning of the service. Traditional liturgy folks, whether of the old stripe or the new stripe, they don't know what to do with 45 minutes of unrestricted congregational singing. And there's disdain. I mean, there's conflict over whether or not drums are allowable in the church, popular instruments are allowed in the church. You have a whole body of organists who are deeply committed to their guild. It's just ripe for misunderstanding and conflict. I also think, thirdly, there's a subtle aspect that's going on here too. So when the folks advocating this new form of traditional worship based on the practices of the early church come along and start promoting a word and table order of worship.
Right.
So that the Lord's Supper becomes standard and you have multiple scripture readings and you get a real kind of rhythm that the first part of the service is for the hearing of the word and then the second part of the service is for gathering around the table. When they start teaching and presenting that and putting it into the denominational resources, they print it out a certain way on the page. And I think there's a stylistic presumption built into the presentation on the page. And that things are going to be fairly sequential, one thing at a time. And even the rubrics kind of subtly point to a certain sort of stylistic appropriation of it. And so the folks caught up with contemporary praise and worship and with a little bit different sacramentality, they take a look at that page, and gathering. Here are these 4 items in the gathering, and then here comes the word. And so you have prayer of illumination, Old Testament reading, Psalm, New Testament epistle, gradual hymn, gospel, sermon, followed by the creed. The contemporary praise and worship people go, they misjudge that, and they go, stylistically, no, that's not what we're doing. So that's actually what we're playing around with here at Duke. And I have some really wonderful graduate students, doctoral students who are experienced contemporary worship leaders and also deeply trained in the worship of the early church. And what we find we have to do in order to do word and table in an authentically contemporary way, we have to turn that sequential order that's found in the denominational book into a story with a plot line.
Right. Yes. Right. Yeah.
And then once we have a story with a plot line, then like a good musical, Broadway musical, you can figure out what parts of that plot line you're going to do in a spoken way and what parts of that plot line you're going to do in a musical way. And all of a sudden you're doing word and table where just looking at it, you've got a 25-minute worship set with a few spoken elements in it to begin the service. But if you break it down, it's actually, the first half of the word and table order from the United Methodist Book of Worship.
Incredible. It's that power of the storytelling aspect of the liturgy in order to do the contemporary style in a way that is more congenial with the traditional style. The aspect of storytelling seems to be maybe that bridge.
Yes, and that is the bridge we have found here, is you have to look at the page where the things are listed and just item by item. It almost, here's the analogy I use. It looks like a play-by-play description of a football game.
Yeah.
Yep. But then you actually read the narrative description or you watch the game and you had a much different experience of it. The play-by-play doesn't give you the experience. And so when we look at the order of worship in our mainline denominational resources, it's hard for them to do initially, but I have to get the students to see one thing, but actually see something else. So they see a listing of acts of worship, but what they actually have to see is a dynamic story of a God who wants to come and gather with his people, offers grace through the scriptures, reawakens their faith in him, and then has this climactic moment of interaction and encounter through the body and blood of his only begotten Son.
Yeah.
And so once you turn it into a story, you can figure out how to do that in a amazingly wide range of artistic ways, including musical.
Yes. And I was having a conversation with a pastor friend recently who was mentioning with the COVID-19 hashtag unprecedented times, the coronavirus stuff, the church has been really affected, obviously, by that situation. And he was asking me if I'd heard anything about churches moving forward with a single service. Churches that had prior had done 2, like you said, 8 a.m. Traditional, 9:30 contemporary on the marquee. He has a sense that his congregation, they need to move forward with a single worship service, trying to figure out how to accomplish that, having a long history of this separate style.
Yeah.
What do you think, as Dr. Ruth, looking ahead, is there a movement to recombine these 2 different styles because of the pandemic? And if so, how's that going to happen?
Yes, I think there will be a move towards synthesis, if I might call it, over time. I don't think the pandemic's going to cause it. it might trigger it to move along more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually take a look at the long history of Christian worship, the almost unrelenting flow of development goes from diversity and variety to uniformity. And it's a cycle that gets repeated over and over and over again. So I would expect it even without the pandemic.
Yeah.
So for instance, you've got a whole generation of young Christians who've grown up in contemporary praise and worship who either never learned or never accepted this about God to God distinction.
Right.
And they discover old hymnody and they sense the passion and the intensity that's in it, and they're drawn to the beauty of it. And they start figuring out ways to do it in a way that feels true and authentic to themselves, but it's actually kind of older sort of liturgical text. Whenever I work, especially with songwriters who are 30 and under, they're not repulsed by older material, even classic material. I've done a workshop, for instance, utilizing Byzantine liturgical material from the 6th century to spawn the writing of new contemporary worship songs. There's a great song, Eden is Open, by a fellow named Josh Lavender. It's almost a direct appropriation of a Kontakion, a sung sermon by a fellow named Romanos from 6th century Constantinople for Christmas Day. Look at the YouTube video. You would never guess that the origins for that would be Constantinople. So I would think there's going to be merger, synthesis over time. I think what the pandemic is doing, and we're still in it, so it's hard to tell. I think it's just going to accelerate some things. If there was already a trajectory, it's going to accelerate it. I think another point of merger is that there are a lot of traditional services all of a sudden have had to up the ante at becoming technologically creative and innovative, which for the last 30 years has been the mainstay of contemporary praise and worship. A lot of the technological innovations have come out of that realm. And so now you have, quote unquote, traditional pastors and traditional services that are beginning to do some creative things technologically. And that will be another point of synthesis, I think, another point. And then there's just the simple fact of the matter. And I think this is a deep point that the Holy Spirit cultivates in us. The New Testament is really clear. By their baptism, Christians belong to each other because we all jointly belong to Christ. And we miss each other. And so perhaps if there's any good to come out of the pandemic, we're willing to intentionally set aside some stylistic squabbles just for the ability to be together again. And to not have to use technologically enhanced forms of congregational singing, but to be able to be in a single space where collectively you can hear the voice of a large congregation that is open to people of all ages and nations and races. I think if there's any upside, the pandemic may help us realize our baptismal connectedness and identity a little bit more and seek to express that in worship.
Thanks for that, Dr. Ruth. Those are powerful words. And as you said them, I felt that in me. So I could verify that that's my desire, to get back with the people of God. And, those divisions, even within a single congregation that may have been important at one time, may be less important now.
Yeah, I invite everyone to reflect on this. The baptismal formula that is used across the entirety of traditional worship and contemporary praise and worship is the same.
Yeah.
I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. If those three can be distinct and yet essentially unified, those are qualities that spills over to the church that has been born out of the Trinitarian life.
Amen. Dr. Ruth, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your knowledge and wisdom in discussing this book, Loving on Jesus. I'll put a link in the show notes to the book on Amazon, so if you're interested in picking it up, you can just click that link. And man, really appreciate, again, your time and perspective today. I feel like we should schedule another conversation sometime because there's more I'd love to pick your brain about.
Can I ask for one favor too, Steve, if you're putting in a link to Loving on Jesus?
Happily.
If there are any listeners who want to follow up on this, revisioning how to do the ancient order in a contemporary way, I and the students here actually have a newer book on that subject too.
Is that Flow?
That's Flow, yeah. So if you could put a link to that too, Flow, an ancient way to do contemporary worship.
Yeah, I'll put that up as well.
The title of that book.
Well, again, thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate the conversation.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity, Steve, and for the opportunity to get a chance to meet you and talk to you. Since the last time we've talked, I've had a light bulb come on in my head.
Yeah.
I teach a course on the history of contemporary praise and worship. And I was in a faculty discussion the other day, and they were talking about, and I'm going to do this course as a travel course. And it's usually a biblical studies person. It's like, we're going to go to the Holy Land, or we're going to go to Istanbul, or we're going to go to Rome. And it's like, I'm going to do my history course and go to Orange County, California. So I look forward to being able to introduce a class of Duke students face-to-face to you one day.
Thanks again for joining me for this episode of Theology in Motion with Dr. Lester Ruth, Research Professor of Christian Worship at Duke Divinity School. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. In case you missed it, the Center for Worship Leadership Psalm Library has recently released its second psalm, Psalm 130, called Out of the Depths. You can find that on our YouTube channel, on Spotify, on Apple Music, on Pandora, wherever I guess music is listened to. You'll probably find it there, Psalm 130, Out of the Depths. And look forward to an episode with Dr. C.J. Armstrong and Kip Fox, who wrote the song, and Ariel, who sang it. And it's going to be a really fun interview. We get to that later on this year. If you're interested in other kinds of episodes on worship leadership, check out our show On the Ground Floor. Or interested in practical skills of musicianship, check out our show How the Soup is Made. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.